The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the sharp, fresh scent of mountain air that usually sits in those old shafts, but something heavier like wet fabric and time. When the cavers' flashlights caught the wall, two shapes came into view. Sleeping bags faded blue and green, pressed side by side against the rock. The stitching along the zippers had been crudely sealed by hand, the thread thick as twine. One of the men whispered, "Don't touch them." And for a long moment, no one did. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I still remember that summer clearly, the way the red dust hung over Highway 180 at dusk, the smell of pine sap carried on the wind from the canyon rim. Back then I was nearing retirement from the Park Service, spending more time at home than in the field. My wife Ellen kept a small garden out back. Evenings were quiet, filled with the hum of cicadas and the soft pop of sprinklers on dry soil. Coconino County in 2010 was the kind of place where you could go days without locking your front door and still sleep soundly. It was around that time I first saw Ray and Nicole. Not that we were friends, I just remember them passing through. Most folks did stopping for gas or coffee on their way north. They were the kind of couple you notice without meaning to, polite low voices matching smiles that came easy. I remember them standing outside the ranger station one Friday morning in early June, squinting at a map spread across their car hood. She pointed, he laughed, and they drove off toward the canyon, dust rising behind them like a short-lived comet. Ray was 26, with an easy manner and a posture that spoke of long hours at a computer. He worked as a graphic designer down in Phoenix building ads for real estate and small businesses. Nicole, a nurse, worked nights at a clinic not far from their apartment. She had that kind of calm presence that made you trust her instantly. The two of them didn't chase adrenaline, they preferred small campsites, simple food, and the sound of wind moving through trees. When I think back on it now, their trip wasn't anything out of the ordinary. People drove up here every weekend to escape the heat. The Grand Canyon was an easy 3-hour drive north, and the roads cut through some of the most beautiful country in the state, stretching fields of scrub pine, the kind of open sky that makes you forget how small you are. For most travelers, those roads meant peace. For Ray and Nicole, they were supposed to be a brief retreat, a couple of days of quiet before returning to city life. The summer of 2010 was dry. The heat didn't break until late evening when the light turned amber and shadows grew long across the valley. That week, I'd been running trail checks out by Ash Fork. Every evening around 7, I'd stop at the ranger station, pour coffee into a chipped thermos, and check the logbook for missing hikers or stranded drivers. Nothing unusual, just the ordinary rhythm of a place that looked after its own. Phoenix folks came through in waves that time of year. They'd buy postcards, ask about bear sightings, complain about the thin air. Nicole and Ray fit right into that stream. What sticks with me, though, is something Sheriff Danner said later, how normal that weekend had been for everyone. No bad weather, no reports of suspicious vehicles, just clear skies and the start of another Arizona summer. It was Nicole's mom, Linda, who first realized something was off. She told me later that Sunday evenings were sacred between them. No matter where Nicole was, on shift, on vacation, it didn't matter, she always called. "Just to let me know she's safe," Linda said, her voice steady but her hands trembling around a paper cup of coffee. When that call didn't come, she didn't panic right away. Maybe they were out of signal range. Maybe they'd stayed an extra night. Arizona's backcountry will swallow a phone signal whole in places. But by Monday morning, both of them had missed work. Their coworkers tried calling, then texting. The phones went straight to voicemail. I still have a clear picture of that first day, the worried relatives gathering near the ranger outpost. The quiet conversation under the shade of the flagpole. The way Sheriff Danner stood with his arms folded, looking down the road as if waiting for headlights that never came. The days that followed blurred together. The desert sun pressed down so hard it turned the air into glass. Volunteers came and went, scanning the same stretches of road, calling names into empty wind. I didn't know Ray or Nicole personally, not really. But when you live in a small community, distance doesn't mean detachment. Everyone helps when someone's missing. At that stage, though, it still didn't feel like tragedy. It felt like confusion, like a story that hadn't found its ending yet. We told ourselves they'd run into car trouble, maybe taken a wrong turn toward the canyon rim. People get lost out here. It happens every summer. The land's beautiful, but it doesn't forgive mistakes. Still, something about it unsettled me. It wasn't the missing car. We lose track of vehicles out there all the time. It was the silence around their names. No traffic camera caught them, no gas receipt beyond that one stop. No one remembered seeing their silver Toyota past Saturday morning. It was as if the desert itself had swallowed their tracks. That night, I drove home slower than usual. The horizon was on fire with sunset, the kind of orange that only lasts 5 minutes before it turns violet. Ellen had left the porch light on. The air smelled of rain that wouldn't come. I remember setting my hat on the kitchen counter, sitting at the table and looking at the phone. I didn't know what I was waiting for, news maybe, or just a reason to stop worrying about two people I barely knew. But the line stayed silent. Sometimes the quiet is what you remember most. That evening I stepped outside before bed. The desert was utterly still, the sky bright with stars. Out on Highway 180, a pair of headlights passed, then faded into the distance. For a second I thought of that young couple, and how easily light disappears out here, one turn, one shadow, and it's gone. And I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere beyond that dark horizon, something had already gone terribly wrong. The night after I saw those headlights vanish into the desert, I hardly slept. The wind had changed directions, carrying the faint smell of rain from somewhere far south, but here the air was bone dry. By morning, word had already spread that a young couple from Phoenix hadn't made it home. Their families had filed missing person reports after they failed to show up for work. I didn't know it then, but that single call would begin one of the longest searches our county had seen in years. I remember standing in the ranger office the next day, coffee cooling on my desk as the sheriff laid out the first map. Their names, Ray Larson and Nicole Edwards, were already circled in red at the top of the report. They were supposed to have been back Sunday evening. They'd last been seen buying gas near the south entrance of the park. From there, they simply vanished. The sheriff tapped the map with the back of his pen, tracing the stretch of Highway 180 where they'd likely been driving. He said it quiet almost to himself. That's a big piece of land for two people to disappear into. By late afternoon, their families had driven up from Phoenix. Linda Edwards, Nicole's mother, looked exhausted but steady. She told the deputies about her daughter's routine Sunday call, how she'd waited by the phone until after midnight. She always calls, she said, eyes fixed on the map. Even if it's just to say they're on their way. There was something about her voice that stayed with me flat, certain not frantic yet, but anchored in the kind of worry that doesn't go away. Ray's father came to quieter, standing behind her with his hands in his pockets. He didn't say much, just nodded as the sheriff explained the plan for the first sweep. That evening, I joined one of the volunteer teams. We were assigned a grid south of the park along an old logging road that cut through the ponderosa pines. The light was fading by the time we reached the end of the trail, that pale blue half-light when everything looks washed clean. We called their names a few times, even though we knew we wouldn't hear an answer. The forest doesn't echo at dusk. It swallows sound. We covered our section until dark flashlights cutting narrow cones through the trees before heading back to base. Over the next few days, the search grew. Helicopters flew patterns over the forest, volunteers on ATVs scanned fire roads and creek beds, and every ranger station within a 50-mile radius was told to keep watch for a silver Toyota Corolla. The first break came about a week later. A patrolman from the Forest Service radioed in that he'd found a vehicle matching the description parked off a dirt spur south of the main highway. I remember the stillness when we arrived. The car sat there under the shade of a juniper tree covered in a thin film of dust, as if it had been parked for days. There were no broken windows, no dents, no blood, just a locked car sitting neatly as though its owners had stepped away for a walk. Inside, everything was intact. 2 sleeping bags in the back seat backpacks with clothes folded inside a camping stove, canned food. On the front seat, the car keys and an open map. There was even a half-empty bag of chips. Their wallets and IDs were still in the glove box. It was all too orderly. That's what unsettled everyone. It looked less like a crime scene and more like someone had pressed pause on a perfectly normal trip. The sheriff's team dusted the car, combed the ground for prints. Only 2 sets were found, Ray's and Nicole's, and they led away from the car before fading into a patch of hard rock. No tire tracks, no signs of another vehicle, just those 2 pairs of boot prints walking off together, and then nothing. The dogs picked up a faint trail, but lost it after a few hundred yards. The forest floor there was a mix of loose stone and pine needles, impossible to read for long. After that, it was as if they'd stepped off the map. I've seen lost hikers before, even bodies, and there's usually a rhythm to it. Clues that tell a story, things left behind in a pattern that makes sense. This one had none of that. Everything about it was backwards. People who run off don't leave their wallets. People who get lost don't lock their car and walk without water. Even the placement of the car felt deliberate, parked far enough from the main road to be invisible, but not hidden. It left everyone uneasy. By the end of that week, hope and logic started to diverge. Families still clung to the idea of a rescue while the deputies began using different language phrases like extended search and missing presumed. The weather turned hotter, the ground cracked, and the air filled with dust. I remember Linda sitting outside the command post one afternoon staring at the tree line. She wasn't crying. She just sat perfectly still the way people do when they've run out of ways to hope but can't stop trying. We kept searching for 2 more weeks. Volunteers covered hundreds of miles. Some brought drones, others rode horseback into canyons too steep for vehicles. The sheriff requested satellite imagery from the state forestry office. Nothing. Every possible theory got aired. Maybe they'd gotten stuck and gone looking for help. Maybe they'd been picked up by someone and driven elsewhere. But every time a theory started to make sense, the facts didn't fit. The car being locked, the phones turned off, the lack of any disturbance. It was like the story refused to hold together. One evening, near the end of the official search period, I drove out to where the car had been found. The area was quiet now, marked by a single orange ribbon tied to a branch. I walked around the clearing, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots. The sun was low, the air sharp with the smell of resin and dust. You could still see faint tire impressions from the sheriff's SUV, but otherwise the land had already begun reclaiming the space. That's the thing about the Arizona backcountry, give it a week and it swallows whatever doesn't belong. Back at the station, the investigation kept unraveling. Phone records showed the last signal from both of their cells had pinged near the same gas station where they were last seen. No activity after that. Their bank cards went unused, credit lines untouched. Surveillance cameras along the route turned up nothing. A handful of witnesses thought they might have seen a silver sedan that day, but no one could be sure. It felt like trying to build a house out of mist. Every time you thought you had structure, it disappeared. After a month, the search was scaled back. The sheriff called a meeting to thank everyone, but you could tell it weighed on him. "We'll keep it open," he said, voice low, but at this point we're out of leads. The families lingered long after the crowd dispersed. When Linda walked up to thank us, she looked older than she had weeks before. "I can't stop hearing her voice," she said quietly, as if speaking more to herself. The way she said, "Talk to you Sunday, Mom." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Some things don't need words. In the months that followed, their case faded from the front page. Every so often a rumor would flare up, a sighting here, a scrap of fabric found there, but nothing ever connected. The sheriff's department filed it under cold before the year was out. For most of us, life went on. But not easily. The image of that untouched car stayed with me. It wasn't violent, not even chaotic. It was silent, precise, like a moment caught between inhale and exhale. I'd seen storms tear through these woods, fires, level acres, but I'd never seen two people erased so completely. Years passed, and the desert kept its secret. Sometimes, when I'd drive north past the same stretch of road, I'd glance toward the tree line, half expecting to see that silver Corolla still there, sunlight bouncing off its hood. It wasn't, of course. The evidence had long been processed. The car returned to the family, but in my mind, it never really left that spot. The image had fused with the land part of the story the earth refused to give back. Every few years, a new detective would take another look at the file, hoping to find something everyone else had missed. Each time it came back to the same truth: nothing new, nothing solid. The case gathered dust in the archives, except for the families who refused to let it die. They kept a website running, posted pictures, anniversaries, appeals for information. I'd visit it now and then, scroll through the photos: two young people smiling in the sun, a tent pitched under tall pines. A life paused mid-sentence. Even now I can recall the last conversation I had with Sheriff Danner before I retired. He leaned against the hood of his truck, looking out toward the horizon. "There's something wrong about that stretch of forest," he said. "It doesn't let go easy." I didn't argue. He was right. Some places feel quiet because they're peaceful, others because they're keeping something. That's how it stayed for more than a decade, just an empty space in the file room and a story no one could finish. And then in the fall of 2021, a radio call came through from the northern ridge. 3 local cavers exploring an old mine had found something. At first it didn't sound unusual, plenty of old shafts out here half collapsed and forgotten. But the deputy on the line said something that made me stop mid-step. They found bags, he said. Sleeping bags. Sewn shut. The words landed like a memory breaking the surface after too many years underwater. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew what they were about to find. After all this time, the desert had finally decided to give something back. When the call came through about the mine, I was sitting in my truck outside the ranger station, half listening to the radio and watching dust swirl in the evening light. It was October 2021. 11 years since Ray and Nicole had vanished, and though I was long retired by then, certain names still carried weight. When dispatch mentioned possible remains and 2 sleeping bags, something inside me went still. I drove out there anyway, knowing I had no official reason to be on scene, just that quiet pull that comes from unfinished stories. The road north wound through dry country yellow grass, bending in the wind, the kind of landscape that holds its breath. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was low enough to bleed through the trees, and a few county vehicles sat huddled near a line of rock and scrub. The sheriff on duty recognized me, nodded without surprise. "You'll want to stand back," he said. His tone wasn't sharp, just tired. Down in the ravine, floodlights cut through the gloom, throwing long shadows across the dirt. A group of men in helmets were rigging ropes over an open shaft. I could smell the metallic tang of earth mixed with something older rot, or the memory of it. One of the cavers who'd made the discovery stood off to the side, pale and quiet, hands jammed deep in his jacket pockets. I remember him saying softly, "We thought they were just old bags. Trash." Then he stopped talking, as if anything more might pull him back down into that hole. It took most of the night to bring the sleeping bags up. The operation was careful, deliberate, and strangely quiet. Each bag came up in a sling coated in dust and soil seams, stitched closed with thick, uneven thread. Even from a distance, you could tell it wasn't factory work. The sight of them, 2 shapes laid out side by side under the cold floodlight, brought a stillness over everyone. Nobody needed to say their names, but we all knew. The mine was less than 50 miles from where the car had been found back in 2010. The odds of two unknown people disappearing the same way in the same county were near zero. When the medical examiner's van finally pulled away, the sheriff lingered beside the empty shaft, his flashlight beam circling the entrance. He didn't say much, just exhaled slowly and looked toward the trees. I could hear a faint night wind moving through the branches. That sound always gets me. It's the kind of silence that feels aware of itself. As I drove home, the highway stretched out in front of me, black and endless headlights carving a narrow path through the dark. Somewhere beyond that light, the desert had kept two people hidden for over a decade, and now, just like that, it had given them back. The autopsy reports came within a week. Even after years of reading case files, what they contained was hard to swallow. Ray's skull had been fractured from a blow to the back of the head, one clean, forceful strike from something heavy. Nicole's injuries were different, the kind that leave no question about what happened. Strangulation. Two lives ended in two separate ways, suggesting a sequence, not chaos. The pathologist also noted something else: both bodies had been dead for at least a day before being placed in those bags. That detail changed everything. It meant whoever killed them didn't act in panic. He killed them, hid them somewhere for roughly 48 hours, then brought them to the mine and sealed them away like an afterthought. I went to see Sheriff Danner after the findings were released. He'd been retired for years too, but came in to consult. We sat in his office, the air stale with the smell of old coffee and paper. He looked older, slower, but when he started talking about the case, his focus sharpened. This wasn't some drifter, he said. Whoever did this knew the land, knew where to hide a thing this deep without it being found. He was right. That shaft wasn't marked on any modern map. It took experienced cavers to locate it. The killer had to have known it existed. Investigators started retracing everything: the car, the gas station stop, the exact route they might have taken south. The mine sat roughly 50 miles from the car's location, accessible only by a maze of rough forest roads. To get there, you'd need a high-clearance vehicle, a solid sense of direction, and time to move at night without being seen. Whoever did it had both patience and familiarity. It didn't feel like a random attack anymore. It felt like a plan. I drove out to that general area one afternoon just to see it for myself. The road was little more than ruts and gravel twisting between patches of ponderosa and low desert scrub. Every so often I'd spot the faint remains of old mining trails, signs from another era. I stopped. The truck turned off the engine and stepped out. The quiet hit me first, thick and absolute. You could walk 100 feet from the road and disappear from sight. That's when I realized how easy it would have been to make two people vanish here. Not by accident, by design. Back at the station, I spoke with one of the younger detectives on the reopened case. He'd been a teenager when Ray and Nicole disappeared. Now he was in his 30s, running the evidence table with the same mix of curiosity and frustration we'd all felt once. "We've got nothing physical," he said, flipping through photos of the recovered bags. "No DNA worth a damn. Whatever was there degraded too far." He looked up, expression tight. Guy knew what he was doing. Wore gloves, maybe wiped things down. You don't keep two bodies around that long without leaving traces unless you plan ahead. We talked about motive, but that led nowhere. It wasn't robbery. Everything valuable had been left in the car. It wasn't personal. Neither victim had enemies' debts or any tie to the area beyond their trip. That left randomness or something close to it. A predator who happened to cross their path. But even that theory felt too neat. Most killers act impulsively, sloppy, scared. This one seemed calm. Too calm. Sewing the bodies into sleeping bags, sealing them with hand stitches, it wasn't just concealment. It felt ritualistic, like he was packaging what he'd done and setting it aside. The sheriff's office re-interviewed anyone who'd lived within 20 miles of that forest in 2010. Former loggers, miners, hunters, people with remote cabins. They checked property records, parole lists, old police reports of violent offenses. The amount of manpower poured into that quiet patch of desert was staggering, but every lead hit a wall. Either the suspects had solid alibis, had moved away, or were long dead. The mine itself offered nothing useful. The nylon from the bags was too generic. The thread came from a hardware store you could find in any small town across the state. Even the soil samples didn't help. No unique mineral traces, no vehicle tracks preserved. It was as if the killer had erased his own footprints from the record. As the months went on, public attention flared, then faded again. A few national outlets ran short features bringing in armchair detectives who spun every theory imaginable, serial killers' cults' mistaken identity. But none of it felt grounded in the facts. The truth was simpler and far colder. A man out there knew exactly what he'd done, and had lived the past 11 years untouched by consequence. Maybe he still lived in that same region, walking into town for groceries, nodding to neighbors, carrying the secret like a pebble in his pocket. I thought often about Linda Edwards during that time. She came up once more for a press conference when the bodies were identified. I stood in the back of the crowd as she thanked the officers for bringing her daughter home. Her voice didn't tremble. She just said she could finally stop waiting for the phone to ring. Afterward, she walked away alone, head bowed, hands clasped in front of her like she was carrying something fragile. Watching her, I realized closure is a word made for other people, never for the ones who lived through it. Every so often, I still get calls from journalists asking what I think happened. I don't have answers, only impressions. The precision of the act, the patience, the distance covered all of it, points to someone who planned carefully, maybe even practiced. But what's harder to accept is the motive or lack of one. There's a kind of violence that comes from impulse, and then there's the kind that grows out of silence, of someone who learns to look ordinary while carrying darkness inside them. I think about that sometimes when I drive past small towns, how behind a gas station or a line of pines, a person could live unnoticed for decades. When night falls out here, the desert cools fast. You can hear every small sound, the crackle of insects, the soft shift of air. I imagine that night back in 2010, the couple pulling over, stepping out under that same starlight. Maybe they heard a voice from the road, someone asking for help. Maybe they trusted him just for a second. That's all it ever takes. 1 second. The investigation remains open, though it's more of a ritual now, files being reread, theories, rephrase the cycle of effort and defeat repeating quietly in an office somewhere. But every so often something surfaces, a scrap of memory from a witness, a half-forgotten rumor about a man who lived alone in the woods. The detectives follow each thread, and I listen from a distance, knowing most of them will unravel. Still, you can't quite stop hoping that one won't. A few months ago, I drove back to that mine road at sunset. The entrance is sealed now, fenced and posted with warning signs, but the ground around it feels the same, dry, still faintly humming with cicadas. I stood there until the light faded, watching the horizon darken over the pines. Somewhere beyond those trees, a man once hid the evidence of his worst act, confident it would never be found. For 11 years, he was right. Now his secret is only half buried, and I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, living among us, waiting for the ground to close over it again. It was late winter when the reports finally landed on the sheriff's desk, the full forensic analysis from the mine site. I'd been helping organize some of the archival evidence, just volunteering part-time, when Danner asked if I wanted to see what they'd found. He said it the way old friends do when the truth is heavy, but they don't want to carry it alone. The lab's conclusions weren't what anyone had expected. They confirmed the causes of death. Ray's fractured skull, Nicole's crushed airway, but it was the timeline that stopped us cold. The entomologist noted insect activity inconsistent with an immediate burial. In plain words, it meant they'd been killed somewhere else and kept above ground for a day, maybe 2, before being sealed inside those bags and dropped into the shaft. The idea turned my stomach. It meant someone had time time to think, to plan to find a place to keep two bodies out of sight before hauling them deep into the woods. The air in that office felt close thick with the smell of old carpet and stale coffee. I remember tracing a finger over the grainy photographs spread across the table, the bags, the hand-sewn thread, the fine dust that coated every fold. Whoever had done this hadn't been improvising. Those stitches weren't panic. They were patience. Danner leaned back in his chair, staring through the window like he could see past the years to where it all happened. "That's not some drifter," he muttered. "You don't get rid of bodies like that unless you know exactly where to put them." And he was right. That shaft wasn't marked on any map. It wasn't the kind of place you stumble upon. You'd have to grow up around here, maybe worked in the old mines or hunted those hills. That knowledge narrows the world, but it also makes it more unsettling. The next few weeks were spent revisiting everything we thought we knew. Detectives went door to door through the nearest towns, pulling old records, talking to anyone who'd lived here in 2010. They found a handful of names, former miners, reclusive property owners, men with old assault charges, but none of it stuck. Too much time had passed. People had moved, died, disappeared. The evidence from the bags was no better. The nylon was generic, the kind sold nationwide. The coarse thread came from a local hardware chain, nothing unique enough to trace. No fingerprints survived, no usable DNA. The desert had stripped the story clean. I rode along on a few of those checks out of habit. The roads wound through thick pine, then opened into stretches of sandstone and grassland that never looked the same twice, depending on the light. In some of those canyons, the silence feels almost alive. You can stand there and hear your own breath move through the trees. I remember thinking about that, how a person could live out here for years unseen, maybe walking past hikers or campers carrying a secret like a stone in his pocket. The idea didn't feel far-fetched anymore. The sheriff's team mapped the distance between the two sites where the car was found and where the bodies ended up. 50 miles, give or take, but the terrain was rough, half of it unpaved. Whoever moved them had a vehicle that could handle it, something with clearance and torque. A truck, probably. It was enough to build a theory, but not to prove anything. Still, it painted a picture the killer kills, hides them somewhere for a day or two, then drives out under cover of darkness. Maybe he works alone, maybe not. He knows the back roads avoids main highways. At the mine, he lowers them down, seals them in covers the entrance, and leaves. After that, he goes home, washes his hands, sleeps. It's the cold efficiency of it that never left me. When I spoke to Linda again that spring, she was calmer than before. There's a kind of quiet that comes after years of waiting, when grief stops shouting and just hums in the background of your life. She said she still dreamed of Nicole, sometimes ordinary dreams like sitting at a kitchen table or folding laundry. She never looks scared. Linda told me, eyes on the horizon. It's like she doesn't know what happened. I didn't have the heart to tell her what I'd read in the report, that Nicole's death was slow personal. Some truths only reopen wounds that no longer bleed. Around that same time, a small team began building a psychological profile of the suspect. They were young, sharp, trained in the new ways of thinking about behavior, mapping patterns, identifying risk types. One of them, a quiet analyst from Flagstaff, walked me through their notes one afternoon. She pointed out the differences in the killings Ray hit from behind, Nicole strangled. It could mean two killers, or one who adjusted his method out of necessity, removing the threat before taking control. Either way, it spoke to composure, not frenzy. The analyst looked up from her laptop and said almost to herself, "He probably lives within 20 miles of both sites." She clicked her pen closed like the thought had settled. We spent weeks following that thread, checking local hunting licenses, property tax records, cabin rentals from that summer. It felt endless, and in the end, nothing concrete surfaced. Every possibility dissolved into coincidence. Still, it changed how I looked at the place I'd called home for most of my life. Every old truck idling at a gas pump, every man buying rope or duct tape at the hardware store suddenly looked like someone who might have done it. It wasn't paranoia exactly. It was just awareness. The understanding that monsters don't live under beds. They live next door. They go to church. They wave when you drive by. The last real push came that fall. A new sheriff had taken over by then, younger and hungrier, determined to shake something loose. He reopened the public tip line, ran features in the local papers, even invited amateur investigators to review the case data. It stirred up the usual noise claims of sightings, psychics, wild theories about cults. But one call stood out. A man from a nearby town reported hearing a vehicle late at night in June 2010, headlights flashing through the trees where they shouldn't have been. He thought it was kids off-roading, didn't mention it at the time. The area matched the vicinity of the mine. It wasn't proof, but it was movement, the first in years. The new sheriff sent a crew out to survey the spot again. They found nothing fresh, just the same silence waiting to close back in. Sometimes in the quiet after those long days, I'd catch myself thinking about the man who did it. I pictured him sitting alone in a kitchen somewhere, the sound of a clock ticking his life moving on in the margins of everyone else's. Maybe he still worked. Maybe he fished paid bills, aged quietly. I wondered if he ever went back to that mine, not to gloat, but out of habit to reassure himself that his secret was still buried. I don't know why, but I think about that more than anything, the notion that after all this time, he might still be out there close enough to see the same mountains, the same roads, and never once be recognized. Before I left the station for good, I asked Danner what he thought. He was sitting behind his old desk boxes of case files stacked around him. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the photo pinned to the wall, the one of Ray and Nicole smiling with the canyon behind them. "There's something about this one," he said. "It doesn't add up because it wasn't supposed to. Some folks plan things so carefully that even luck can't ruin it." Then he took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and whispered, "But nobody hides forever." That line stayed with me long after I left. The drive home that evening was quiet. The desert was pale under the moon, endless and empty. Somewhere out there, past the ridge lines and the dry wash, a man had buried 2 people in the dark and walked away without looking back. The land had kept his secret for more than a decade. Whether it would keep it forever was another question. And I remember thinking as I turned off the highway toward home that maybe the desert doesn't forget. It just waits for the right wind to start uncovering the truth again. The following spring, the investigation began to slow again, and I could feel it happening the same way you can feel the desert cooling at dusk gradually, almost politely, until you realize the warmth is gone. The new sheriff stopped calling me for updates, not out of neglect, but because there wasn't much left to say. Every test had been run. Every theory walked down to its quiet dead end. The case still sat open on paper, but in practice it was back where it had started. 2 lives taken, 1 man out there somewhere, and no name to pin to what he'd done. That kind of unfinished truth lingers differently. It doesn't shout. It just sits with you patient and heavy, waiting for the years to wear you down. I remember cleaning out my old truck one morning and finding a folded topographic map from the early days of the search. The paper had yellowed, creased along the same roads we'd driven back and forth that summer in 2010. I traced the lines with my thumb, the spot where their car had been found, the forest trails, the ridge that led to the mine. For a moment it felt like touching a ghost of the land itself, one that had held its secret too long. There are places out here that will never be fully known, no matter how many boots walk across them. Some truths stay buried not by distance, but by design. In the months after the discovery, the families finally laid Ray and Nicole to rest. The service was small, private, and held under the open sky near Phoenix. I went standing toward the back, not wanting to intrude. Linda spoke briefly. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled when she said her daughter could finally come home. She didn't speak of anger or forgiveness, just peace, however small it came. Ray's father read something too, though I couldn't tell you the words anymore. What I do remember is the wind moving through the cemetery trees, bending the flowers laid on the caskets. It sounded almost like breathing. After the burial, a few of us gathered in the parking lot. No one talked about justice because we all understood by then that justice wasn't coming, at least not in the way we'd hoped. Some killers get caught, some get named, and some simply dissolve into the cracks of the world, their faces blending into crowds, their memories fading until all that remains is the harm they left behind. That's the kind that changes a place. People around here don't camp as far off the main road anymore. Folks lock their doors at night even in towns that never used to. And if a stranger waves you down on the shoulder, you keep driving. We learned that lesson the hard way. Every so often, reporters still call me hoping for a quote or some final insight that ties the whole thing together. I tell them the same thing each time: there's nothing new to find, at least not in the evidence. What's left is quieter than that. It lives in the spaces between what we can prove and what we can only feel. When you spend enough time in these landscapes, you start to understand how they keep secrets. The desert doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the truth all at once either. It waits. It watches. And when it finally decides to reveal something, it's rarely the answer you were hoping for. Sometimes I still drive past the turnoff where their car was found. The road is half overgrown now, grass pushing through the cracks, the sign rusted to the color of dried blood. I pull over sometimes, kill the engine, and just listen. The forest there has a way of sounding hollow, like the air's been stretched too thin. In those moments, I think about the young couple standing by that same road years ago, sunlight on their faces, not knowing what waited just ahead. It's a cruel thing how ordinary a day can be right before everything goes wrong. I've asked myself countless times why this case still sits so deep in me. Maybe it's because it never really ended, not in any clean way. Or maybe it's because it reminds me how fragile the line is between safety and loss. You can spend your whole life believing the world is mostly kind, and then one stranger can erase that illusion in a heartbeat. But even knowing that I can't bring myself to hate the land where it happened, I still love it here. The red dust, the smell of pine after rain, the long evenings when the sun drops behind the canyon and the sky turns the color of fire. It's beautiful, but it asks something of you to remember that beauty doesn't mean safe. Last fall, on the anniversary of their disappearance, the sheriff's office placed a small marker near the old mine site. Nothing elaborate, just a bronze plaque mounted to a stone, their names etched above the dates. I went out there alone before the dedication, early in the morning. The air was cold enough to sting, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. I brushed away some dust and stood there a long time, not saying anything. It wasn't about finding closure. It was about bearing witness to the lives they lived, the questions that remain, and the fact that some stories don't end so much as they fade into the landscape that held them. When I finally turned to leave, I noticed the wind had shifted, moving down from the north. It carried the faintest echo of laughter, or maybe it was just the creak of trees, but for a heartbeat it sounded human. It reminded me that for all we lose, traces still linger. Footprints vanish, files close, but the feeling of a moment, the love, the fear, the unfinished promise, those things don't die. They settle into the soil, waiting for someone else to feel them. Maybe that's the only kind of justice the earth can offer. Back in town, life looks the same as it always has. The gas station still stands near the park entrance, its fluorescent lights humming at dusk. New travelers come and go, chasing the same postcard views. They don't know that two people once passed through there and never made it home. Maybe that's mercy. Maybe forgetting is its own kind of survival. But for those of us who remember, it's hard to drive that highway without feeling the weight of what's missing. The land doesn't forget, even when we try. I think about Ray sometimes, the easy grin he had when someone told a joke, and about Nicole, who always stopped to photograph small things, flowers, clouds, shadows on water. I picture them together, walking hand in hand, unaware that someone had already chosen their ending. That thought used to haunt me. Now it just reminds me why stories like theirs need to be told. Because silence is where cruelty hides best, and memory is the only light that keeps it from growing. When people ask what justice would look like now, I tell them the truth: I don't know. Maybe it's someone somewhere waking up one morning unable to carry his secret anymore. Maybe it's just the rest of us keeping their names alive. Either way, the story doesn't belong to the killer anymore. It belongs to them, to the lives they built, the love they shared, and the lessons they left behind. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for curiosity, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Out here where the desert meets the sky, every echo carries farther than you think. And sometimes, remembering is the only way to make sure the silence doesn't win.